The order did not arrive with cameras flashing outside Buckingham Palace gates. There was no royal announcement, no press conference, no emotional statement from the palace balcony. Instead, according to whispers spreading through Windsor itself, the instruction arrived through secured estate channels with language so cold, so final, that several longtime palace staff allegedly reread the document twice before realizing what it actually meant. Frogmore vaults, empty immediately before Harry's next return. And according to explosive palace chatter, King Charles himself allegedly approved the operation after weeks of private pressure building behind closed royal doors. What stunned insiders was not simply the retrieval order itself, it was the timing, because according to royal commentators, Buckingham Palace had spent years carefully preserving at least the illusion that Prince Harry still maintained some symbolic pathway back into royal life, even after the interviews, even after the memoirs, even after California transformed into a permanent battlefield between monarchy and Sussex narrative. Frogmore Cottage remained standing quietly inside Windsor grounds like the final surviving bridge connecting Harry to the institution he once defended with absolute loyalty. But suddenly, insiders claim that bridge was no longer being preserved. It was being dismantled piece by piece with terrifying precision. According to whispers moving through palace administrative circles, estate officials were allegedly instructed to conduct a full internal review of all Sussex-linked holdings still connected to Frogmore operations, including archived storage materials, secured furnishings, dormant communications hardware, access credentials, and private logistical inventory tied to Harry and Meghan's former royal occupancy. Some insiders even claimed confidential transport units were quietly reassigned during unusual late-night hours across Windsor grounds, while restricted inventory teams allegedly moved through secured estate storage facilities under heightened confidentiality protocols. And suddenly, palace aides reportedly realized this was no longer about property management. This was institutional severance disguised as administration. According to several royal insiders, the phrase now quietly echoing through Buckingham Palace is chillingly simple: no unfinished Sussex structures remain. And that phrase alone reportedly sent anxiety spreading through royal offices because it revealed something far larger unfolding beneath the surface. The monarchy was allegedly entering a colder operational phase where emotional flexibility no longer outweighed institutional control. The old era of compromise was ending fast. Sources claim Prince William's growing influence inside royal strategy discussions became impossible to ignore during the weeks leading up to the operation. Palace whispers increasingly suggested William viewed Frogmore Cottage not as sentimental family history, but as a dangerous symbol of unresolved ambiguity hanging over the monarchy's future. According to some commentators, the future king allegedly pushed for absolute clarity surrounding royal access, institutional privilege, and lingering Sussex ties before Charles's reign entered an even more fragile stage. And then came Princess Anne. According to royal media speculation, Anne allegedly supported the harshest interpretation of operational discipline during private palace conversations. Insiders described her approach as brutally simple: duty before blood, structure before sentiment, stability before reconciliation. Some palace veterans reportedly even compared Anne's influence during the Frogmore crisis to the late Queen Elizabeth's hardest moments, periods when emotional pain was allegedly buried beneath institutional survival. That comparison reportedly unsettled Charles deeply, because according to multiple royal commentators, this entire operation allegedly exposed the painful divide between Charles the father and Charles the sovereign. On one side stood a king still emotionally tied to his younger son despite years of public warfare. On the other stood a monarch surrounded by advisors warning that unresolved Sussex structures now threatened long-term royal stability during one of the most fragile periods in modern monarchy history. Sources familiar with palace culture claim Charles initially hesitated over the scale of the retrieval effort, but once updated estate reports allegedly revealed how many dormant systems tied to Frogmore still technically remained active behind the scenes, the conversation reportedly shifted from emotional reconciliation into cold operational language. Security liabilities, administrative confusion, institutional boundaries, resource burden. Suddenly, the issue no longer sounded like family conflict. It sounded like structural instability. And according to insiders, that changed everything. The atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace reportedly hardened almost overnight. Conversations became shorter, meetings more restricted, confidentiality warnings intensified. Staff allegedly noticed unusual changes in internal transport scheduling and secured inventory procedures throughout Windsor grounds. Even experienced aides reportedly sensed something irreversible had been set into motion. Meanwhile, according to whispers spreading through California-based Sussex circles, the retrieval order reportedly landed like an emotional earthquake, because for Harry especially, Frogmore Cottage allegedly represented far more than property. It symbolized one of the final surviving emotional connections to the royal life he once believed would define his future forever. Marriage, family, legacy, belonging. And now, according to palace insiders, every emptied vault, every reclaimed credential, every cleared inventory shelf reportedly symbolized another thread being cut permanently. Some royal observers even began comparing the operation to a form of modern institutional exile. Not exile through dramatic confrontation, but through administrative disappearance. The slow removal of infrastructure until eventually nothing remains except memory itself. And according to insiders, that is exactly what made the situation feel so devastating inside palace walls. Because monarchies rarely announce emotional endings directly, and what reportedly terrified palace insiders most was not the emptying of the Frogmore vaults themselves, but what the operation allegedly revealed about the monarchy's future direction. Because, according to whispered conversations moving through Buckingham Palace corridors, this was no longer simply about Harry and Meghan. Frogmore had allegedly become the testing ground for an entirely new royal doctrine, one built around discipline, containment, and absolute institutional clarity before Prince William eventually takes the throne. Royal commentators increasingly claim the operation exposed a brutal internal realization spreading among senior palace figures. The monarchy could no longer survive prolonged emotional ambiguity. For years, insiders say Buckingham Palace attempted to balance public compassion toward Harry with the practical demands of protecting the institution itself. But after endless interviews, memoir accusations, legal battles, and ongoing media warfare, many within the palace allegedly concluded the middle ground had completely collapsed. There was no longer any workable space between reconciliation and separation. And according to palace whispers, Frogmore became the symbolic casualty of that conclusion. Sources familiar with royal operations claim the most sensitive phase of the retrieval effort allegedly focused on vault inventories connected to private Sussex-era storage holdings. While details remained fiercely guarded, insiders speculated certain archived materials tied to Frogmore occupancy were quietly reviewed, reassessed, and flagged for either institutional retention or permanent deactivation. That alone reportedly triggered enormous anxiety among aides because nobody fully understood how far the operation would ultimately go. Some commentators even whispered about growing fears that the palace was preparing for future constitutional scenarios involving Harry's long-term royal status itself. Whether accurate or not, the rumors spread rapidly because the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace had allegedly become deeply defensive. Every unresolved Sussex connection was now reportedly viewed through the lens of risk management rather than emotional family healing. And according to several royal historians, that psychological shift may ultimately become one of the defining transformations of Charles's reign. Because behind the silence, the monarchy itself allegedly feels under siege. Charles reportedly understands the emotional cost better than anyone. Insiders claim the king's private struggle during the Frogmore crisis became painfully visible behind closed doors. One moment, he allegedly viewed Harry as his son trapped inside years of bitterness and emotional damage. The next, he reportedly faced relentless warnings from palace advisors insisting unresolved Sussex ambiguity now threatened the stability of the crown itself during an already dangerous transition period shaped by health fears, public scrutiny, and William's rising authority. And according to royal commentators, that pressure slowly cornered Charles into accepting something he emotionally resisted for years. The institution was moving forward with or without Harry. Meanwhile, Princess Anne's alleged influence over the crisis reportedly became impossible to ignore. Palace insiders increasingly described Anne as the embodiment of the monarchy's old survival instincts, ruthless discipline hidden beneath calm silence. Some even claimed her response to the Frogmore situation was chillingly direct behind palace walls. If exceptions survive, instability survives with them. And according to several royal observers, that philosophy reportedly gained enormous traction among senior officials terrified about the monarchy's long-term future. What once looked like emotional flexibility now allegedly looked dangerous. What once looked compassionate now allegedly looked weak. And inside palace strategy discussions, those distinctions reportedly changed everything. The shadow of Queen Elizabeth II also reportedly hung heavily over the operation. Palace historians quietly suggested the late Queen's lifelong obsession with continuity above personal emotion had effectively returned to dominate internal royal thinking once again. Stability before sentiment. The crown before the individual. The institution before family fracture. According to insiders, that old philosophy allegedly resurfaced with terrifying force during the final stages of the Frogmore retrieval protocol. And by the time the last reviews were completed, many aides reportedly sensed they were no longer witnessing temporary palace housekeeping. They were watching the formal burial of the Sussex era inside royal life, not publicly, not dramatically, but administratively, which somehow felt even colder. Now, royal insiders increasingly believe the monarchy has already crossed a line it may never fully reverse. Because once an institution begins systematically removing symbolic pathways back into the fold, reconciliation itself reportedly becomes harder to imagine. Frogmore Cottage once stood as proof that despite all the public warfare, some emotional bridge still survived between Harry and the House of Windsor. But according to whispers now spreading through royal circles, the emptying of the Frogmore vaults allegedly carried one devastating message louder than any palace statement ever could. The bridge was never being repaired.